In this story, written by Rotsoil, we discover a man who will stop at nothing when pursuing creative talent. Be wary of what you post on the internet, or else you may attract the attention of a certain person who insists that you have a contract. I was walking home from school with my friends when the voice called out. I ignored it. I thought it was just someone making a scene. My friends and I were silent for a moment before we dissolved into mocking the voice and fits of nervous laughter. We had been on our way to my house to hang out, and just as my house came into view, we heard the voice again.
Hey, we had a contract.
It sounded like it was right behind us. An uneasy feeling fluttered in my stomach as I realized the voice had either followed me to my home, or they were actually talking to me. My eyes darted to my friends, and they looked at me as if to say, "Do you know this guy?" Slowly, we all turned to the source of the noise and saw a rusty old car trailing behind us. A man was leaning out of the window, calling after us. There was a feral look in his beady little eyes that made his rat-like face look rabid. My heart lurched as the car suddenly sped up and swerved toward us like it was planning on hopping the curb. We all took off in different directions. Paul and Ron ran across the street. Ben continued up the sidewalk in the direction we had been walking, while Logan ran back down it the way we had come. I turned right and cut through someone's yard. Behind the houses on this street was a wooded area. I don't think it was big enough to be called a forest, but I had used it as a shortcut many times. I knew if I went straight through the other side, it would bring me to a street near my house. I also figured if the car was going to come after me, the trees would slow it down. I looked back to see what it was doing, and sure enough, the car pulled partially up one of the house's driveways and then veered into their yard. I sprinted into the trees towards a makeshift fort someone had been building. A torn tarp had been left inside of it, and I quickly slid under it. My heart pounded painfully as my ears strained to listen for the sound of someone walking through the crunchy leaves that covered the ground from seasons past. But it never came. I waited as each heartbeat punctuated each passing moment. As slowly as I could, I inched forward to peek out from under the tarp as some internal voice screamed at me not to. I half expected to find him standing right next to me, peering down at me from his small eyes. But he wasn't there. Relief flooded through me at a dizzying speed. I crawled out from under the tarp and stood up so quickly I felt lightheaded. Frantically, I looked around for the man before running the rest of the way out of the wooded area. The car was nowhere to be seen, and I didn't want to risk going back where I had split from my friends to find it. I took a longer route the rest of the way home, turning down random streets that just wove in circles within my neighborhood. All the while, I found myself glancing nervously over my shoulder. Whoever that guy was, he seemed highly unstable, and I was thoroughly rattled. When I decided it was finally safe enough to go home, I was only slightly relieved my parents weren't there. Once inside, I firmly locked the door behind me, and then I went around the house and double-checked the window locks and pulled all the curtains shut. I pulled out my phone and sent a text off to the group chat to make sure everyone was safe. One by one, texts from each of my friends popped up. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. Everyone was safe. I let out a nervous laugh and asked if anyone had known who the guy was, or if it was a prank. Nervous energy churned in the pit of my stomach as no one fessed up. maybe it was just someone from the loony bin, I thought. I wandered into the kitchen for a snack, and as I poured milk and cereal into a bowl, I tried to think of any mental hospitals that were in the area. Just as I raised the first spoonful to my mouth, a thump at the door caused me to jump. The spoon clattered to the floor, showering the floor with its contents. I crept towards the door, waiting to see who it was. A second later, my mom opened it. "Can you help?" she asked when she saw me. She had several grocery bags laying in the doorway. "Sure," I mumbled as I gathered some of the bags. She picked up the rest and we carried them into the kitchen. I guess she noticed I seemed spooked because she asked, "Are you okay, James? You look feverish." "Oh, and you're filthy. What have you been doing?" I didn't answer as I wiped the cereal off the floor and started to unpack some of the groceries. Once the groceries were put away, I finished my cereal. It was a soggy mess by that point. Mumbled something about homework and went up to my room. I locked the door and then shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I flopped onto my bed and stared at the ceiling as the events looped in my mind. I was certain I had never seen the man before, but he had been so insistent that we'd had a contract. What would I even have a contract for? I was just a kid. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to my phone buzzing as text notifications flooded the screen. My friends were discussing whether or not they should tell their parents. Paul's parents were never home, and Ben's parents were too overprotective. If he told them, they would probably never let him leave the house again. Everyone seemed to agree they should keep it quiet, but it left a sour taste in my mouth.
"James?"
A voice called from somewhere in the house. My dad was home, and he would know what to do. I rolled off my bed, tore the chair from under the doorknob, and dashed down the stairs, but stopped short when I saw both my parents standing at the front door. They both had a serious look on their faces, and a heavy lump formed in my stomach. "What's going on?" I asked.
"James, there's someone here who needs to speak to you. I don't know what this is concerning, but it sounds pretty serious. I think you better come down here,"
my dad answered. He looked at me gravely, and as his words settled over me, my hair stood up. I wanted to turn and run back up the steps, but the look on my parents' faces forced me to continue down the steps.
"We had a contract,"
a familiar voice shouted from the other side of the storm door. The porch light glinted off his greasy hair. Instantly, ice crawled down my back. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut. My mother looked at me in mortified horror. "James!" "Look, I don't know what he told you, but I don't know him." My voice trembled as the words left my mouth.
"Why does he say you have a contract?"
My father frowned. "I don't know, I swear," I cried. Fear squeezed my heart as I realized somehow this guy had found out where I lived. I was careful when I came home today. There was no way he could have followed me. And now my parents, were they in danger? "What would you even have a contract for?" my mom asked as she crossed her arms. "I need to tell you guys something," I said. I pushed them both towards the kitchen as a voice rang out from outside the house.
"I've spoken to several attorneys."
My parents said nothing as they sat at their respective places around the kitchen table. I rubbed my now sweaty palms against my jeans while they looked at me expectantly. I gulped in air and in one breath said, "So, today I was walking home with the guys, and we heard someone yelling and we thought it was just someone being crazy. But then he started following us and we all ran away, but he followed me, and I ran into the woods and there was this fort thing, and I hid under a tarp. And then he wasn't there anymore, and I was extra careful when I walked home. And I made sure no one was following me, but now he's here." My father leaned forward.
"James, this is serious. He's talking about getting lawyers involved."
"I don't have a contract with him. I've never seen him before in my life." I shook my head.
"Are you absolutely sure? We can't help you if you're lying,"
was all he said. My mother didn't speak. "I swear, I have no idea what he's talking about."
"Alright, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to drive you to school tomorrow. If he shows up at all, we're calling the police. If he shows up here again, we're calling the police. If you see him at all, do not speak to him. You come straight home, lock the doors, and you call your mother or me, and then you call the police. Do you understand?"
he asked. I nodded furiously, then he muttered,
"Something isn't right with him."
I didn't get much sleep that night. I half expected the guy to burst into my room screaming about a contract. The next morning was uneventful. My father dropped me off at school and acted like everything was fine, but I saw how he constantly checked the rearview mirror the whole ride there. He also waited until I was inside the building to pull away from the curb. The trouble came when the dismissal bell rang. After yesterday's events, I didn't really want to go home by myself. My dad had already gone into work an hour later than he should have, and my mom was coming up on a deadline at work. She came home every night complaining about how tired she was and how glad she would be once the project was done. Not wanting to add to either of my parents' stress, I decided to walk home again. I thought if I asked my friends to come with me and we were extra careful, my parents wouldn't mind. But Paul had detention, Ron had practice, and Ben had agreed to tutor someone. That left me with Logan.
"What was up with that guy yesterday?"
Logan asked as we headed towards the school doors. "I don't know. He thinks I have a contract with him, but I've never even seen him before. Maybe he's crazy. Ben's grandma has dementia, and sometimes she thinks she's back in her 20s, and she tries to go out dressed like a hooker. Maybe it's something like that," Logan said as we pushed the doors open. The parking lot was already half deserted. "Yeah, so you want to come over today? I don't really want to be alone if that guy shows up again," I asked, trying not to sound whiny. "Can't, man, sorry. Madison needs help with her, math homework." Logan gave me a wolfish grin as a car pulled up to the curb in front of us. A blonde girl wearing sunglasses snapped her gum as Logan climbed into her car. I sighed and pulled out my phone, dialing my dad's number. When it went to voicemail, I tried my mom. I left them both a message telling them I would be walking home and that I'd call them if I had any problems. As soon as I stepped off the school's property, I felt on edge. "Get a hold of yourself, man," I whispered to myself. "Nothing's gonna happen, he's just some wacko." I forced myself to walk until I came across a street that led into my neighborhood. As I approached the third house, I frowned. There was a van parked in front of it that I was pretty sure didn't belong there. The man who lived there was very particular about how his yard looked. I'd seen him outside several times measuring the grass after he had cut it, to make sure it wasn't too high or too short. He drove a classic car that he had restored himself. If he had known there was a dirty old van parked in front of his house, he would have had it removed. I stopped walking, not wanting to get any closer to it. I glanced across the street to make sure no cars were coming, and as I turned across, something stung my neck. Instinctively, I turned and raised my hand to my neck, but But as I did, the world spun. My legs felt like they were made of jelly, and my feet were full of cement. I crumpled to the ground as darkness swallowed me. When I awoke, I was sure I was dreaming. I was in what looked like a damp basement. The only light came from small windows near the ceiling. From what I could see, iron bars crisscrossed across the windows. My vision was fuzzy as I struggled to take everything in around me. I was in some kind of large cage or jail cell bolted to the wall. Half a dozen kids were with me. They looked pale and dirty, like they hadn't seen any sun for a while. One little girl had a piece of paper and some crayons, while a boy had a dirty piece of crumpled paper and was struggling to write something. By the way he was holding the pencil and moving his arm to form the letters, I suspected he wasn't old enough to have been writing for long. The other 4 kids huddled close to each other. A boy with a shaved head sat in the corner with his head back against the wall. His mouth hung open with the soft breaths of sleep. Another little girl sat hugging her knees, watching the other 2 sitting cross-legged, doing some kind of weird handshake. "Where am I?" I whispered. The kids jumped, startled by my voice. Curiosity and confusion crossed their faces, except for the kid who was sleeping. He was still snoring softly. "You're old," the boy who was writing said. "Yeah, why are you so old?" one of the handshake kids asked. "What do you mean?" It occurred to me that I was the oldest person in the room. I guessed it was because he could more easily overpower and control children. The girl who was hugging her knees started to cry. "What's going on?" "Did he take you too?" the girl who was drawing asked. "I guess so," I answered. I looked at them as they stared at me. None of their faces seemed familiar. "I'm James. Who are you guys?" The kids hesitated a minute, looking at each other warily. The drawing girl answered first. "I'm Ava." When no one else spoke up, she sighed and put down her crayon and pointed to each kid in turn. The writing boy was Maddie. One of the handshake boys was Jordan, and the other was Ethan. The sleeping boy was Declan, and the other girl was Sophia. "Sophie came right before you did. That's why she's so sad. She misses her mommy," Maddie explained in a small voice. "I bet you all miss your mommies and daddies, huh?" I asked. They all nodded solemnly. "What are you guys doing?" "I'm drawing a picture and Maddie's writing a story," Ava explained. I was about to ask why when a door squeaked open, and a heavy silence filled the air. A chill gripped my spine as I recognized the greasy-haired man who entered the room.
"Well, let's see what you got for me today,"
he addressed the kids. He slid one of his arms through the bars of the cage and snatched the paper from Ava and Maddie. They immediately crawled away from him and immediately huddled against the other children. There was a long silence as he studied the papers.
"Garbage! This is garbage!"
he roared as he crumpled the paper and threw it at the cage.
"This is not what we agreed to."
Fueled by rage, he flipped the table over and started throwing whatever he could find at the walls. A chair, a plastic cup, a container of stubby crayons. Then he stormed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind him. "Who was that?" I asked. "That was Mr. Gregg," Declan answered. Greg's tantrum had finally roused him. "And you guys are drawing and writing for him?" I was puzzled. Ava nodded. "He said he would pay us if we did." I didn't need to ask if Gregg had held up his end of the deal. "How long have you guys been here?" I asked. They shrugged at me. I was sure there was no way for them to know that. I patted my pockets, looking for my phone, but they were empty. Suddenly, the door swung open again and Greg charged in.
All right, here's what we're going to do.
He righted the table and set a notepad on it and then went to retrieve the chair. When he approached the cage, the kids pressed themselves against the wall, trying to get as far away from him as they could. Greg pulled out a keychain and unlocked the door. As he stepped in, a disgusting odor filled my nose.
You, come here!
He reached out and grabbed my arm, and with surprising force pulled me out. He slammed the door shut and locked it again. Hey, get off me! I twisted and pulled, trying to free myself from his grip. Greg pushed me down into the chair.
Get writing!
Greg stared down at me expectantly. You want me to write? I asked. Why me?
We had a contract.
What contract? Why are you doing this to me? I asked as frustration built up inside of me.
You wrote a short story and posted it on the internet. I read it and I really liked it. I told you that in the email I sent you. I don't normally work with teenagers, but your story was riveting. I liked it so much I sent you a contract.
He answered. But it was a lie. I mean, I did write a story and post it on the internet, and I had gotten a few emails from people telling me they liked it. I had gotten an email from someone asking if I would write some more stories for them in exchange for some money, but it had sounded too shady, so I had ignored it. No, we didn't! You're crazy! I shouted.
Crazy, huh? You want to see crazy?
Greg sneered, and as my blood ran cold, I knew I had made a mistake.
Just give me what I want when I want it.
He stomped back over to the cage, unlocked it, reached in and pulled Declan out. No! Declan cried. The other kids clung to Declan and tried to pull him back in, but Greg was stronger. Sophia started crying again as Greg dragged Declan to something that sat in the far corner of the basement. It looked like some kind of weird, ramshackle machine. It had a chair attached to it and some kind of helmet with tubes and wires that ran to the machine. Greg pushed Declan down into the chair and forced the helmet onto his head. As soon as Greg flipped the switch on the machine, it lit up and emitted a clanking, wheezing noise. As the machine worked, Declan started screaming. It looked like something was being sucked out of him through the helmet. Declan's screams rang in my ears long after he had stopped. After what felt like forever, Greg finally turned the machine off. Declan slumped forward, and when Greg removed the helmet, Declan crumpled to the floor. His skin looked gray and lifeless. The only sound in the basement was Sophia's sobs as Greg carried Declan toward the door. He shot me a look as he passed the table I was still seated at.
Right!
And then he was gone. I felt sick to my stomach as my emotions twisted in my gut. A crayon stub laid on the floor near my foot, and despite willing my arm to move and pick it up, it was like my arm was full of lead. Seconds felt like hours as time passed. Finally, a voice spoke, and I was surprised to hear it was my own. "What the hell is that thing?" I asked. "It sucks the creativity out of you," Ava whispered. "If you don't do what Mr. Gregg says, he'll put you in that machine," Maddie said. "What does he do with all the creativity he sucks out?" I asked. The kids were silent for a while until Ava spoke up again. "He uses it to make stories and videos and then he sells them." My mouth went dry, and I struggled to swallow the lump that had formed in my throat. Profiting off the hard work of innocent children. as if kidnapping and enslaving them wasn't bad enough. "Hey, any of you have a pencil over there?" I asked. A plan formed as a pencil rolled across the ground towards me. I got to work writing. I sat with my arms crossed, waiting for him. After an immeasurable amount of time, Greg finally came back.
"Well?"
he asked as he strode over to me. The paper was face down on the table. I wanted it to be a surprise. Anticipation bubbled up inside of me. I gripped the pencil so hard I thought it might snap. He frowned as he reached for the paper and flipped it over. Every nerve in my body tensed as I waited for his reaction. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest.
"Eat shit, Greg,"
he read. Before he could react, in one fluid motion, I stood up and lunged at him. With all of my strength, I plunged the pencil into Greg's neck, about where I thought the carotid artery was. Greg stumbled back, clutching at his neck as blood trickled out from around the pencil. Behind him, I could see the children watching us, their eyes wide with horror. I grabbed the keychain from where it was clipped on Greg's pants and fumbled with them, searching for the one that would unlock the cage. I decided it might just be easier to try shoving each key into the lock. Sweat tickled its way down my spine as I worked frantically. Finally, after I felt far too much time had passed, the lock clicked open. I wrenched the cage door open, but the kids huddled in the corner, frozen with fear. I glanced at Greg, who was whining and writhing on the floor. I didn't want to risk having him get up and lose the chance for us all to get away. "Ava," I said, holding my hand out to her. I looked her in the eye and gave her a small nod. I hoped she would trust me. Slowly, she reached out and took my hand. That was all they needed. The other kids followed as I pulled Ava out of the cage and we headed for the door. Upstairs, the house was almost empty. The kitchen looked like a pigsty. Dirty dishes and discarded takeout containers covered every available surface. The living room had an armchair and a laptop, and that was it. No other furniture. The shades were pulled down, and aside from the children's drawings and papers with scribbled words tacked up, the walls were bare. The house smelled like it had never been cleaned. I led the kids to the front door and flung it open. A chilling, dark night greeted us. I had no idea where we were, and it looked like Greg's house was in the middle of nowhere. But I still had his keychain, and it included the car key for his old beat-up car. I piled the kids in and started driving. It took an hour until things started to look familiar. I drove to the police station and tried to explain my story. But it wasn't until Ava and Maddie spoke up that the cop began to take us seriously. They called my parents and I gave a statement. As I waited for my parents to come get me, I watched as the kids were reunited with their parents. They choked out thank yous in between their sobs of happiness. My parents apologized profusely for not answering when I had called, and I apologized for trying to walk home alone. I should have just waited for them. The police called the next day to inform us they had found Greg's house. It seemed he had been renting it from someone who had listed the house on the internet. They told me that Greg hadn't been there, that the house had been deserted. I hung up, feeling numb. I knew he was still out there, and as I checked my email later that day, my spine turned to rubber. I had a new email from an address I didn't recognize. "We're not finished. We had a contract."